Okay. See you guys in Kiev in 1 second. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon if you're anywhere in Europe. Good afternoon to me. And thank you very much for coming today. Thank you very much for your interest in my talks and your interest in the Jewish history of Ukraine, specifically Kiev and Odessa. And we'll also visit Nipra today. Let's begin because I have a lot of things to show you. Oh, I'm sorry. And many things to tell you about. Here we go. The Jews of Ukraine, Kiev, Odessa, and Nipra. Here we are. We are in the map, on the map of Ukraine, and Kyiv is located right here on the Nipra River. This is the biggest river of Ukraine. If we look at Kiev in general, it's a large city. It's the capital of Ukraine. It's a home to about 3 million people and a home to a decent Jewish community of about 21,000 Jews. And again, I tell you that my data is pre-war. I can't tell you what it will be, and we don't know what it will be after the war. Kiev, it's this combination of old and new architecture, some of the old churches and monasteries, some of the new residential neighborhoods, and the river, Dnieper River, wide and powerful with lots of boats going up and down, giving air and beauty to this city. Kiev, it's the city where in the very heart of the city, on the central square, you come and you find the monument to this man whose name is Bogdan Khmelnytsky. And today we're going to discuss why this person, who is observed by us, by Jews, as the most terrible man, one of the most terrible men in the history, why his monument is located in the very heart of Ukrainian capital. And at some point, Kiev very much reminds me and many other people of Moscow, thanks to this Stalin architecture. Kiev, as the capital of Ukraine, was very much rebuilt in the Soviet times, so that's why we see here wide streets and Stalin Empire style buildings, residential, and these towers and so on. Some parts of Kyiv fortunately preserved their historical atmosphere. For example, this very neighborhood, which is called Podol, it's former Jewish neighborhood. It was mainly populated by Jews, and it preserved its curved streets. And when you walk up and down here, left and right, you'll see the mentions, the houses that originally belonged to the Jewish families. And Kiev is considered as the stronghold of Orthodox Christianity, of course, observed this way, both by Ukrainians and by Russians as well. Now, the land where Kiev is located, before Slavic people came to this land, it belonged to a state which is called Khazaria, or you can call it Khazaria. Same problem as you have with the Kharkiv and Kherson, KH at the beginning. Khazaria was the large state. Kiev is right here on the eastern, near the eastern border of Khazaria. Why are we interested in it? First of all, we know for sure that there were many Jews living in Khazaria, and they lived there freely without limitations. There were lots of Jewish merchants passing through Khazaria because it's exactly on the trading routes from east to the west. And Khazaria is that unique state which at some point around 8th century converted to Judaism. Khazar people, they were not Jewish by blood, they were not Jewish by birth, but in the 8th century it was first the head of Khazaria, the king, and then the elite of Khazaria that converted to Judaism. And it's a pretty unique story. And Khazaria, especially because it existed for a short period of time and then almost disappeared, up to today attracts the attention of historians and also writers. There are several fiction books about Khazaria explaining the state. How do we know about Khazaria becoming Jewish? For example, we have the coins. Most of the countries surrounding Khazaria, they were Muslim, so their coins would have a special Muslim text saying that the Muhammad is the messenger of God. The coins from Khazaria had Moses on it, and it says Moses is the messenger of God. For us, it's important to think, it's a very important thought to understand that Jews had been living in Kiev, in this area, even before Slavic people first came here. In 1882, Slavic troops came to this area, fought against Khazaria, and took over Kiev and rebuilt it. So on the original spot, the new town was built, and Kiev became the capital of a state which was called Kievan Rus, because it belonged to the whole group of Slavic tribes, and they had general name as Rus, and it's Kievan because the capital was located in Kiev. Jews continued their life in this town even with the new government coming in. How do we know that? For example, we had this unique Kievan letter, which was discovered in Cairo, Geniza. It's the letter written in Hebrew around 930, so in the early 10th century, and it's the letter written by the representatives of Kiev Jewish community to some other Jews, to the Jews in another Jewish community in some other place, requesting for money. They needed money to help one of the community members. Another evidence of Jews living in this area. For example, this is the model of Old Kiev around 11th, 12th centuries. It was divided into 3 sections. Each part of the city was surrounded with the wall, and there were gates. And so when we walk around Kiev today, we pass the square, which is to the right on your screen. It's called Lviv Square. There is a shopping mall there. It's exactly the place where in 11th and 12th centuries, Jewish, or Zhidovsky in Ukrainian or Old Russian, Jewish gate was located. So we understand that Jews kept living in this place. And we have another evidence, which is very well described in the chronicles of the Russian, in the Russian chronicles. In the early 12th century, Russian Prince Vladimir Monomach had to come to Kiev and take an action to stop the riots in the city. And so they were riots because the moneylenders, Jewish moneylenders of course, put a very high interest rate. So Vladimir Monomach had to come to the city and exile Jewish moneylenders from Kiev to stop the riots. So there are lots of evidences from all different sides explaining the Jewish life in Kiev in those days. Plus, there are letters sent by the rabbis, there are books written by the rabbis in Kiev. All in all, in 11th, 12th centuries, Kiev is a very big city. It was one of the largest and the most beautiful and the most successful and the wealthiest cities in Europe. There was no other place like Kiev those days. There were over 100,000 people living there. There were 8 market squares. So it was always located on the crossroads of the trading routes. So of course it attracted Jews a lot. And there were many Jews living here and Jews running very successful business. Jewish traveler Benjamin of Tudela, he never visited Kiev, but once he came to Constantinople, he heard of Kiev and explained it in the late 12th century as a large city on the confines of the empire meaning Byzantium Empire. He thought that in winter it's so cold that nobody ventures to leave his house, but that's not true, of course. See, people living in this weather conditions are used to them, so we have fur coats and we know how to warm ourselves up during winter. All that beautiful life ended up in the 13th century when most of the Russian territory, including the territory of contemporary Ukraine and including much of the territory of contemporary Russia, Western Russia, was conquered by Tatar Mongols. Kiev was burned down, nearly leveled to the ground. Most people were either murdered or stolen to slavery, and it concerned people of all ethnic origin and all religion. So Jews, together with Slavic people, were murdered or stolen to slavery, and the city has fallen into desolation. It took Kiev many centuries to gain that importance as it had before. And so for some period of time, we don't hear about Kiev. We see Kyiv on the map again in the 14th century, when most of the territory of contemporary Ukraine was occupied by Lithuania, this bright yellow. This is the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And then, as you know, Lithuania made this union with Poland, so they formed all this yellow and light yellow and beige. This is Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Kyiv is part of it. In that state, in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Jews were welcomed and they were allowed to settle in towns. Jews came back to Kyiv, which it went under the rule of Lithuania and then Poland. It wasn't easy. At least twice in the history, in the late 15th and early 17th century, Jews were exiled from Kyiv because of the conflicts with the Christian population. In any case, in the early 17th century, Kyiv is a tiny town, very small, with no more than 10,000 people. With that, it lost its importance and it lost its fame because it was so much destroyed. And for Poland, it was too far to the east to actually pay attention to it. When we speak about Poland, there is a certain social structure which we are going to discuss in details in September, speaking about shtetls, but today, for the purposes of our talk, we better understand it. So social structure of Polish state is this. On top, they're Polish landlords and Catholic Church. Second level, there are Jews who serve as managers, as middlemen, or the managers of the landlord's property. So they collect taxes, they control markets, they buy and sell. So they are in between landlords and peasants. Now, third level, Cossacks, and we discussed them last time, the independent military group, and they're Orthodox. And on the bottom, there are Ukrainian peasants who are very poor, who pay high taxes, and who are also Orthodox. Looking at this structure, you easily see the way for the conflict. And of course, this conflict sooner or later had to happen. And this, we come to the middle 17th century, to the Bogdan Khmelnytsky uprising. Looking at this map, you'll see that most of the central Ukraine, the center of modern Ukraine, this is modern Ukraine, and this is the central part of it, was all controlled by Bogdan Khmelnytsky as a result of that uprising. It was the uprising organized by Cossacks. He was the head of Cossacks, and the uprising was against Polish magnates, Catholic Church, and Jews as middlemen. The uprising was to defend poor Ukrainian peasants and defend themselves and gain more independency as Cossacks. The reasons were simple: the extreme poverty of Ukrainian peasants, very high taxes, very difficult laws, and also it was a religious conflict because Polish landlords were Catholic and Ukrainian peasants were Orthodox, so there was constant pressure from the Catholic Church. At the end of that uprising, Bogdan Khmelnytsky signed a treaty with Moscow, Russia, so Ukraine became part of Russian state, of Moscow, Russia. Why? What were the advantages for him? It was the same religion, Orthodox, and it was absence of Jews. In Moscow state, there were no Jews. Zero, absolutely. And for them, they viewed it as an advantage because they hated Jews, seeing them collecting taxes, seeing them selling alcohol, seeing them controlling markets and so on, and also privileges and lands that the Russian Tsar gave to Cossacks. So this is the reason. In Ukrainian tradition, Cossacks are national heroes, and Bogdan Khmelnytsky is the first person in the history who fought for Ukraine, for the independence of Ukraine, for good, to defend poor Ukrainians against bad landlords, bad Catholic Church, and bad Jews. So that's why you have the monument to Bogdan Khmelnytsky in the heart of Kyiv. You have Khmelnytsky streets in every city, nearly every big city of Ukraine. And you have even a city called Khmelnytsky in Ukraine. We Jews, we view it exactly opposite. We remember that the killing was not only directed against the Jews, it was directed against Catholic Church and Polish landlords. For Jews, it was absolute devastation. Kiev was cleaned out of Jews. Not a single Jew was able to survive. Certain villages and towns where they came in, they just couldn't stop raping and killing. There is a book written and published in 1653 by Nathan ben Moses of Hanover. It's available in English translation, The Abyss of Despair. He is the witness of Bogdan Khmelnytsky uprising, so he explained in every detail how exactly Cossacks were murdering Jews, how exactly they treated Jews, what exactly was going on in the territory of Ukraine. And the numbers, the biggest number I've seen is that up to 300,000 Jews were murdered, and many were sold on the slave markets in Turkey and Africa. So you know, in Jewish tradition there's a special name. It's called Tashvetat, the Hebrew letters that represent numbers that correspond with those terrible years of 1648-49. So from the middle of 17th century, there were no Jews in Kiev for a certain period of time. Jews are back to Kiev in the late 18th century. What happened then? Now, Kiev, together with most of Ukraine, was part of Russia. In the late 18th century, remember, Russia took part of Poland and received that new land and new Jews. New Jewish population, and what's called the Pale of Settlement was formed. You have it here on the map on the right of your screen. It consisted of that Polish lands where Jews had been living since ever, and also part of Ukraine was put together with that land. So some part of Ukraine was also given to Jews so they could settle there. So there was a small Jewish community that was formed in Kiev, in this northern part of Kiev. It's called Podol neighborhood. It's close to the river, and that's exactly that area that we spoke a little bit at the beginning. They built 2 wooden synagogues, had a Jewish cemetery in 1827. The Russian government decided that Kiev was too important, too of a holy city, that it didn't work for Jews. So Jews were again exiled from Kiev and prohibited to settle there. The situation changed only in 1860s, and we also spoke about it, when Russian czars had new laws to let the wealthiest and the most useful Jews settle everywhere in Russian Empire. And because Kiev was so very attractive, it had a river, it's this crossroad, you can have a big market there, it has great business potential. So Jews started coming to Kiev from surrounding shtetls. And if in 1862 there were 1,400 Jews in Kiev, then in 1872, in 10 years, there were already nearly 14,000 Jews. And it's only official data. By the times of the First World War, they were at least 82,000 Jews. And again, it's only official data. The real numbers could have been much more. Being small national minority, Jews occupied leading positions in Kiev business. By the late 19th century, nearly half of all Kiev merchants were Jews. Every 4th thing that was produced in Kiev was produced on Jewish manufactories. What Jews gave to Kiev, what unique thing Jewish gave to Kiev? It's called contract market. Contract market. This is the square. It's Contract Market Square. It's located in Podol, in that Jewish neighborhood. It exists up to today. It's the square in 19th century and then now. It's a fair where you sell not a piece of cheese or a liter of milk, but you sell and buy mortgages. You sell estates. You sell businesses. You sell contracts for wheat and bread and sugar for the next year. More than 60% of contract fair participants, all middlemen, were Jews. And so the period of this contract fair every year, it was the flourishing time for Kyiv. It was time to make money. It was time when even, the last person, the courier, the street cleaner, the beggar could make money for the next year. When we walk around Kiev, we shall definitely remember the family Brodsky, two brothers, Lazar and Lev Brodsky. They're Brodsky, meaning their family originate from the shtetl Brody, which we're going to discuss next time. Lazar and Lev Brodsky, they controlled much of the sugar market in Russian Empire. They had lots of other businesses in Ukraine and specifically in Kyiv. They had giant city mill in Kyiv, they had brewery, and they had paper production. And they controlled most of the transportation in Kyiv and the region, railroads, and the city tram, and the Nipra shipping company. They established water supply system in Kyiv. Look at this nearly castle. This is the Kyiv Polytechnic University that they sponsored the construction of. Walking around Kyiv, you pass this wonderful historical market. It exists up to today. This market, it was Lazar Brodsky who built it, and who built it and gave it to the city, and he wanted that 25% of its income would go to the charitable activities. And the theater, and the hospital, and another hospital. There's a long list. There is a long list of the places, that the buildings that were given to Kyiv, not specifically to the Jewish community, but to all inhabitants of Kyiv by Lazar and Lev Brodsky. And of course, they built a synagogue. It's Grand Choral or Brodsky Synagogue. It's old photograph, a new one. After in Soviet times it was used as a planetarium. Now it's back to the Jewish community. Look at this building. It's massive. It's impressive. It's grand. It's expensive. It's built to show off. It's built with this high ceiling, with this beautiful hall. It's a liberal synagogue of its time. They were looking at the best examples in Western Europe. They were looking at German synagogues. Look at those beautiful balcony, open air balcony for ladies in this hall with the chandeliers. The synagogue was confiscated during the Soviet times, and prior to the war it belonged to some institutions. That's how it survived the war. It was not destroyed by Nazis. It was returned to the Jewish community after the fall of Soviet Union, and in the March of 2000 was reopened finally after the restoration. Most of the active synagogues that you see today in Ukraine will have this very portrait, because most of them, with very few exceptions, belong to Khabad community, to Lubavitcher Hasidim. You walk down Kyiv and you turn left and right, and you see these gorgeous mansions, gorgeous homes. All of them belonged to Jewish merchants. These gorgeous houses belonged to merchants that became so successful in Kyiv. Kyiv, thanks to the activity of Jews, just became flourishing city. And it was very hard because the government of Kyiv constantly did not want Jews. So it was a constant fight between Jews and the government. It's another synagogue in Podol, in that Jewish neighborhood, dates back to the late 19th century. It was also confiscated in the Soviet times and reopened after the war, after the Second World War. In Soviet Kiev from 1945 to 1991, this was the only active synagogue. It's it's relatively small and intimate. Though on high holidays it was visited by about 30,000 people. You can't really imagine how this small synagogue could accommodate all those Jews. See, in Soviet times, even being cut from religion, even not being able to continue the religious tradition, still Jews of Ukraine stayed more traditional, more orthodox than more traditional, let's say, more dedicated to the Jewish traditions than, for instance, Jews of Leningrad or Jews of Moscow, and so on. This is how Podol synagogue looks like today, and it recently received this gorgeous, very modern, very avant-garde stained glass windows that may remind us a little bit of, for example, Chagall tradition. Galitskaya synagogue, the synagogue built by the Jews from Galicia, also originally built in the early 20th century, closed in the Soviet times, and recently returned to the Jewish community. Now it's occupied by Midrashat Zionit, the Israeli Jewish community. March 1881, in St. Petersburg, Russian Tsar, this one, Alexander II, is assassinated by the terrorists. What impact it had on Jews? It started Jewish pogroms all around Pale of Settlement. In every Ukrainian city, there was a Jewish pogrom in the spring of 1881. Government viewed those pogroms as a fulfillment of people's love to their Tsar. They said, it's just Russian people, Russian, Ukrainian, Orthodox people love Tsar so much that they want to kill Jews because they love the Tsar so much. And the nationalistic press constantly blamed Jews in all sins. Imagine, in 1881, you open the newspaper, Russian Banner, and it says that Jews are people as dangerous to mankind as wolves, scorpions, and that Jews must be placed artificially in such conditions so that they perpetually die out. That's the atmosphere in Russian Empire after the assassination of Alexander II. In Kyiv, that pogrom of late April 1881, it mainly directed homes and shops. Over 1,000 Jewish shops and homes were destroyed, and several Jews were murdered. Governments say that the pogroms are provoked by economical activities of Jews, so yes, Christians just want to murder them. The second wave of pogroms, and it's not only Kyiv, it's all around Pale of Settlement. It's October 1905. This time it was more blood. It's over 100 Jews were murdered and hundreds wounded, and many thousand houses and shops destroyed. It's 1905 when so many well-known Jews started leaving Russia actively. First wave of immigration, it's after 1881. Second wave, it's after 1905. It's the time when family of Golda Meir left Kyiv. It's the time when Sholem Aleichem left Russian Empire. In Kyiv, local authorities actively contributed to the rioters. It was Kyiv police chief, the person who's in charge of the security in the city, standing on the balcony of the governmental building and calling on the rioters, beat the Jews, rob, breaks. The army, instead of protecting Jews, participated in the pogroms. There was no defense. For Jews, there was no defense. And if a Jew tried to defend himself, he became a criminal, so he was arrested. Instead of arresting rioters, police arrested Jews. Kyiv is also famous for the blood libel of the early 20th century. It's called Bailey's Trial. It's in March 1911. The dead body of a 12-year-old boy, Andrei Yushinsky, was found in a cave in the outskirts of Kyiv. So it was decided that, of course, he was the victim of the ritual murder. So Mendel Bayless, this man on the left, was arrested and sent to prison. An investigation took 2 years. The best lawyers of the country came to Kiev to defend him, including Oskar Grusenberg, the famous Jewish lawyer from St. Petersburg. Amazingly, despite the incredible pressure from the press, despite the incredible anti-Semitic atmosphere, the jury, 12 nearly uneducated and illiterate Ukrainian and Russian peasants, very simple people, finally pled Menachem Beilis not guilty. Thanks to the incredible talent, first of all, of Oskar Grusenberg. No wonder in Tel Aviv there is a street named after him. Civil war was really bad in Kiev. Kiev Jews did not manage to buy their lives out as Kharkiv Jews did, and they were pogroms organized by Cossack army in Kiev. Jews were associated with communists, and so this idea to kill Jews was somehow something that united everyone without exception. In Soviet times, in 1920s and 30s, Kiev, for a certain period of time, became the center of Yiddish culture, Yiddish Soviet culture. Religious and Zionist institutions were all closed. It was all illegal in Soviet Union. But there was very active development of Soviet Yiddish culture. There were Yiddish schools, there was Yiddish theater, there was much literature was translated from Yiddish and to Yiddish. Like, for instance, Sholem Aleichem was translated into Russian. There was even a Yiddish newspaper there, but it ended up by the late 1930s. Before the war, there were about 225,000 Jews in Kiev. They were nearly 26% of the population. Nearly 100,000 Jews left the city. We spoke about it, joining the army, and some were evacuated together with the places, with the working places. As soon as Nazi occupied Kiev on the 29th of September in 1941, it was this very advertisement that all Jews had to come down to a certain person with documents, money, and the personal belongings. I'm sure you know the name Babi Yar. It's here, Babi Yar. It's a forest near Kiev. It's the place where Jews were shot. First they were shift. There were 34,000 Jews, and then during the period of 1941-43, another 200,000 people were murdered in Babi Yar, and most of them were Jews. In Soviet reality, Kiev Jews were absolutely prohibited to speak about Babi Yar. If Kiev Jews after the war tried to, let's say, go there to this forest and have a meeting, let's say on 29th of September, to say Kaddish, to just speak, to maybe pronounce the names of their relatives, it was absolutely prohibited. There was a police waiting for them, catching them. It was something not to speak about, not to mention, not to remember. The government tried to build a residential neighborhood there. It didn't work. There was some natural environmental tragedy. This water came down and lots of people died out of accident. In 1976, this Soviet monument was erected. There's no mention of Jews, not a single image that looks like a Jew, not a single word. Nothing, as if it never ever existed. In the beginning of this current war that Russia runs against Ukraine, maybe you saw on the television this very menorah that was damaged during the bombardments of Kiev. It's the new monument which was only erected after the fall of Soviet Union in 1991, the monument in Babi Yar. It's actually this whole thing about the memory of Holocaust in the Soviet Union. It's a big and very interesting subject. If you like, we can have this conversation one day, because there's very interesting research done on the subject, and I can show you some of the monuments that were put up. It's a separate, interesting and separate talk. Kiev is the home to the only Soviet Jewish pogrom. The only Jewish pogrom in Soviet Union took place in Kiev. It was September 1945. The problem was Jews came back to Kiev after the war, many from the front, and many from the evacuation. So you come back from the front, you come to your apartment where you had been living before the war, but there are other people living there. So you go to the police because you need to get a special paper, the order that you can live in this apartment. Because in Soviet Union, there was no private property. People were given permit to live in an apartment. So you go to the police, you get your permit, you come to the apartment, you say, I'm sorry, I'm back to my apartment, could you please leave? But people who live there, they don't want to leave. That's exactly what happened. The case was that there was a Jewish man who came from the front and who saw Ukrainian family in his apartment. The conflict started and he took out his gun because he came from the front. He had the gun with him and he shot 2 Ukrainians. It created a giant scandal in the city. The whole city came to the cemetery to cry for those 2 men, and the pogrom started as a flame fast. And there were 5 Jews murdered, there were many seriously wounded, over 100 ended up in the hospital. This is first time in Kiev history that the government acted in favor of Jews in its own way. They stopped the pogrom, they arrested that Jewish man, and they stopped it with KGB and the army and the police, and the message was very clear: we're not going to tolerate Jewish pogroms in Soviet Union. And the policy of Soviet government was to return Jews their pre-war houses and apartments, and it clearly stated it. Soviet period of the Jewish history in Ukraine, it's a typical for the Soviet history of Jews, without much access to the religion, with lots of limitations in universities, with lots of difficulties getting into the universities and colleges, which only in 1970s Jews started leaving Kiev, going to Canada, to the United States, to Israel. And the situation only changed after the fall of Soviet Union. Now you can find Hanukkah on the streets of Kiev. You can come and visit the Museum of Sholem Aleichem. This is something interesting. This is the village, it's Khabad village that was built near Kiev specifically for Jewish refugees that started running from eastern Ukraine as soon as the military conflict between Ukraine and Russia began in 2014. So it's Khabad village, Jewish village near Kiev. From Kiev, I want to take you to the south. I want to take you to Odessa. Odessa, it's the city located on the shore of Black Sea. It's the city which has this Tel Aviv breeze, the atmosphere of the sea shore of the port. It's relatively young city, only established in the late 18th century. It's a home to about 1 million people and 30,000 Jews, and it's one of the most beautiful cities on the territory of former Soviet Union, and definitely one of the most beautiful places in Ukraine. It has this wonderful boulevards and fountains and beautiful architecture and theaters and opera houses and marine with yachts and cruise ships. And the staircase, Potemkin staircase, which is supposed to remind us of Spanish staircase in Rome. And look at this shopping mall. We may think we're in Milano, right? But no, we are in Odessa. And Odessa has wonderful food. It is just such a pleasant and warm and unique place. And it's just, you just walk the boulevard. There's so much of music. There are so many books and so many stories connected to Ukraine, to Odessa. Originally, it was the fortress. It was the Turkish fort that Russia conquered during the Russian-Turkish War. And in 1794, Russian Tsarina Catherine the Great decided to build the new city as military and commercial port and gave it the name Odessa. And from the very beginning, invited different types of people to come and settle here. So Jews came to settle in Odessa from the very first day of this new city. Odessa was very lucky with its governors. In the early 19th century, there was French governor Duc de Richelieu, who, using the money of the Russian Tsars and his energy, built Odessa in the most beautiful way, with the wide streets and parks and Orthodox and Catholic churches and synagogues and hospitals and theaters and markets and schools. So by 1815, when Odessa was just 20 years old, it was already a prominent European city with as beautiful as European capitals. More, in 1819, Odessa was given a status of Porto Franco, free trading, duty-free import and export of goods. From that moment, Odessa attracted, first of all, Jews and Greeks and many others, people who wanted to try their fortune, who wanted to come, make some money, and start working as dealers, buying and selling foreign goods. It was a chance to become rich right away. Odessa became the main transshipping point on the Mediterranean and Black Sea trade. So in the early 19th century, in this new city, there are already 7,000 Jews coming here from all of the Pale of Settlement, from all different parts of Ukraine, in order to change their life, to make money, to become somebody different, somebody else. In the Jews built synagogues and have cemetery and build hospital and form different unions, everything they have to have, because it's a community life, and they have this air of freedom in Odessa. All that period of the early 19th century, there was incredible feeling in the air, the feeling of freedom. By the late 19th century, there were already 150,000 Jews, and they made about 35% of Odessa population. Although I have to tell you, in the understanding of any Russian-speaking Jew, Jews were 100% of Odessa people. Brodskaya Synagogue, 1863, the synagogue built by the Jews that originated from Brody. Very impressive, grand, famous synagogue. By now it's still being used by the State Archive of Ukraine, and it's in a poor condition now. It was famous all around Ukraine. It has the best choir in all Ukraine. It was very advanced. It's very modern. Jewish community of Odessa is liberal. It's the community that does not want any limitations of the shtetl. There was a case when there was a rabbi who wanted the congregation to be kind of stricter, to stick to the most strict traditions. So he was beaten and sent away from Odessa. This community did not want it. Another city synagogue of Odessa, 1850, another grand and impressive building. It was confiscated in the Soviet times and returned to Jews after the fall of Soviet Union. The cemetery, look at the cemetery. I have a nice cemetery with a beautiful fence, and it's just nice. It shows how secure and comfortable the community feels in Odessa. Odessa is a birthplace of many things connected to the Jewish life. For example, it's a birthplace of Jewish pogroms in Russian Empire. The first pogrom took place here as early as 1821, and all along 50 years from 1821 and 1871, there were pogroms as a result of conflict between Greeks and Jews, because they competed on the market. They competed on the market who would control big business, bread and grain export, banking, and so on and so forth. Despite the pogroms, Jews controlled most of it. Odessa is a birthplace of Jewish self-defense. The whole idea that will become Haganah in Israel, that will become the army of Israel, it was born here in Odessa. It was 1881 when Odessa Jews reacted to pogrom, not hiding in houses, not applying to the government, but organizing self-defense squad. They were butchers, there were some strongmen and cabmen and blacksmiths, but there were also students and professionals. This man to your right, Waldemar Wolf-Hefkin, he is a doctor. He's the one who developed and used vaccines against cholera and bubonic plague. He was the head of that first Jewish self-defense group in Odessa. It's Odessa Jews who decided that from now on we're going to defend ourselves and our communities. It was very difficult because the government kept arresting the members of Jewish self-defense. Odessa, up to today, you come to Odessa and you see these kind of buildings. The buildings that form squares with lots of tiny apartments. Each apartment has a small balcony. All of them overlook the inner courtyard. So everything is known. Like your neighbors know everything. They know the color of your pants. They hear how exactly you speak to your husband. They know all about you, and you can spend half of your day sitting on the balcony and talking to your neighbor who sits on the next balcony. And your son comes down to play with other kids, and you yell from the balcony like Moshe, and he puts his head and says, Mom, am I hungry or cold? This is Jewish life. There were Jews who became wealthy in Odessa, but there were many more Jews who stayed very poor, who lived in this in this area, and who lived in these tiny apartments, and they created their own language, mix of Yiddish, Russian, Ukrainian, and even some French. There is a writer, Isaac Babel, the Jewish writer from Odessa, who explains Odessa in the most beautiful and interesting way. He says, think, it's a city in which it is easy to live, in which it is clear to live. Half of its population is Jews, and the Jews are people who have learned a very few simple things very well. First, they get married in order not to be lonely. Second, they love in order to live forever. Third, they save up money in order to have houses and give their wives fur jackets. Fourth, they love children because it's very good and necessary to love your children. That's exactly the life of Jewish Odessa. And Odessa in Russian speaking culture is famous for its anecdotes. We consider Odessa as a birthplace of a Jewish anecdote. Anecdotes are difficult to translate, but I can try some. Like you can imagine, like you ask Monia, you ask your child, Monia, how much is 7 multiply 8? And he replies, are we buying or selling? Or a wife asks her husband, Sema, why don't you wear a wedding ring? And he's like, in this heat? Or two friends come to visit, and one of them knocked the door with his foot. Why are you knocking with the foot? Asks the second. So that the owners think our hands are busy with gifts. Otherwise, they won't open. There are lots of anecdotes and humorous stories that were born in Jewish Odessa. Odessa is called in Russian as Odessa Mama, Odessa Mother. Why? It's the mother of Jewish criminal world in Russian Empire. And Odessa Jewish criminals were the most, were the smartest and the most interesting. For example, look at this man. He's not criminal. He is Israel Ruchamovsky. He's a goldsmith and metal worker. But by the commission of some man, he created this. It looks like Greek tiara. And the commissioner managed to sell it to Louvre as Greek tiara from the 3rd century BC for enormous money. It was put on display in Louvre, and it's only its perfect condition that made specialists suspicious, and finally they realized it was not from the 3rd century BC, it was new. Now it's known to be in Israel as the work of a talented Jewish jeweler. Jewish criminals in Odessa created their own world and their own language. To be honest, the criminal Russian and Ukrainian criminal language is all based on Yiddish. It's all Yiddish and Hebrew roots of the words. And there was a whole system of different types of thieves, for example, cutlets and treasurers and pigeon catchers and zippers and swindlers, lots of them. It's very much romanticized. There are movies about Jewish criminals in Odessa and books about them. This man in the center, his name is Mishka Yaponchik, Michael Japanese, and this is his team. He was the king. He was the king of the Jewish criminal world of Odessa. In 1905, when the next Jewish pogrom came down, Mishka Yaponchik, Michael Japanese, together with his team, his squad, they led Jewish self-defense. They had guns. They were experienced. It was incredibly bloody pogrom. It lasted for 5 days and nights, and about 500 Jews were murdered, several thousand Jews seriously wounded, tens of thousands of houses were robbed and destroyed, but Jewish self-defense forces were several thousand people. Lots of Jews joined it. Jews gathered and armed themselves with everything that was at hand: axes, billhooks, shafts, to defend women, to defend children, to defend houses. Odessa Jews did not want to be victims. They wanted to defend themselves. This idea of having your own pride, to be self-esteemed, to be willing the better future. This is from Odessa. Zionism. Look at this man. We all know Theodor Herzl. The Zionism in Eastern Europe. It's this man, Leon Pinsker, a Jew from Odessa, who in 1882 published his famous book, Auto-Emancipation, saying that now we feel not only as Jews, we feel as men. And as men, we too wish to live like other men and be a nation like the others. Leon Pinsker is the founder of Hovevei Zion, that organization that purchased land and established Petach Tikva and Rishon LeZion in Israel. Odessa, the lives of incredible people crisscrossed there, because Odessa was this boiling pot where new ideas came to life. Its Mayor Dizengoff, the future first mayor of Tel Aviv from 1897 to 1905, he lived in Odessa. He was a merchant. He was a director of a glass blowing factory and a manager of the commission office. After 1905, he, as many other smart Jews, left Ukraine, left Russian Empire because of those terrible pogroms. Similar time when Mayor Dizengoff just came to Odessa, another Odessa Jew, Zev Jabotinsky, turned 17. So the different ideas, different types of Zionism, they were all born here in Odessa. Moshe, this little boy is Moshe Chertok, future Moshe Sharet, the second prime minister of the state of Israel, with his parents. His father is reading a newspaper in Russian. It's called Odesky Listok, the News of Odessa, published by Jews. In Odessa, photography, movies, and mass media and typographers, the printing houses. It was all purely Jewish business. Literature. Chaim Nachman Bialik, you know his name, no need to represent him. He lived in Odessa, that's his house. And here he had a chance to communicate with other Yiddish and Hebrew writers. Look at this beautiful group. Shalom Aleichem lived in Odessa very short period of time in this very house, but here he wrote one of his best novels, The Adventures of Menachem Mendel, explaining that phenomenon of that man of the air. Violin players, Jews play violin. In Odessa, they used to say if an Odessa child goes without a violin, then he plays the piano. Why? Why every second Jewish boy in Odessa had to learn playing violin? Because in those poor neighborhoods, when parents wanted better life for their child, they thought, what kind of job he can get? Oh, if he learns to play violin, he can work in the orchestra, because orchestra needs many violinists. They may need one person playing drum and one person playing piano, but every orchestra needs many violinists. Then, if he does well, he might be able to go to St. Petersburg and get a permit to study and settle there. If he does very well, he may go to Vienna and change his life for better. So lots of those balconies that we saw had Jewish boys standing there and playing violin, learning to play violin day by day. This is the railway station in Odessa. I'm going to stop the presentation in a second and switch on a short piece of music. It's the Yiddish song, you probably know it. It's the Yiddish song which is called 7:40. It speaks about a train which arrives at 7:40. It speaks actually about this train station. There was a story that one day Jews of Odessa heard that Theodor Herzl was supposed to come and visit Odessa, and he was supposed to arrive by the train from Kyiv at 7:40. So many Jews came to meet him. He never arrived. He actually never thought of coming to Odessa. It was pure like fake news. But the song was created explaining the story. It doesn't mention Theodor Herzl. Instead it says, we're waiting for him at 7:40. We're waiting for the train to come, and a train is going to bring us a man. His green eyes, and Theodor Herzl had green eyes, are looking to the east, to Palestine, to the land of Israel. He's wearing a special kettle-shaped hat. That's exactly the type of hat that Herzl wore. So not naming him specifically, Odessa Jews managed to explain him very well. So here's what I'm going to do. I stop this presentation and start this one and the sound. Here we go.
Odessa, fin Kiev der Paravos, Menschen mir verzufrieden, darf geagole jeden Kind, in Odessa, fin Kiev, Paravos. Mit Titzen dort in Freilich, getanzen schöne Mädel, und die Buchhiere mechetebs mit die Fies. Sie zitzt auf euch in dort in vielen Sachen siehst, Gott soll helfen, sind es dein bei uns. Titzen dort in Freilich, die tanzen schöne Mädel, und die Buchhiere mechetebs mit die Fies. Sie zitzt auf euch in dort in vielen Sachen siehst, Gott soll helfen, sind es sein bei uns.
It's absolutely incredible how Odessa Jews influenced so many things in Jewish culture. Ruslan, this famous ship known as the Israeli Mayflower. In 1919, after the revolution, there was this ship that brought 671 passengers from Odessa to Jaffa, to the land of Israel. Why it's called Mayflower? Because among those passengers, there were those who would become Israeli elite in politics, in culture, in science. There were scholars, architects, doctors, poets, writers, composers, painters, the future members of Knesset, actors, and so on and so forth. Not to mention few, Baruch Haggadati, the Israeli ballet dancer, choreographer, and the father of the movie production in Israel. Rachel Bluestein, the famous Rachel the poetess, the Hebrew poet whose portrait we have on the banknote of 20 shekels. Joseph Klausner, an incredible historian. He became a professor of Hebrew literature and the redactor of the Encyclopedia Hebraica. He came to Israel. He went aboard of that ship with the limit that he said, I'm only going if you let me take my library with me. The story of Ruslan is absolutely incredible. And it's like you take Jewish elite from Odessa and bring them at once to Israel. And that's why so often Odessa is being referred as the cradle of Israeli culture, because there's so many connections. 1941, Odessa was occupied by a German-Romanian army. It was the state called Transnistria formed here, and Odessa became the capital of it. More than half of Odessa Jews managed to leave the city before occupation. Lots of Jews from Western Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania were brought to Odessa to be murdered there. I better tell you about those who survived. First of all, there were several hundred Jews that survived in concentration and death camps. Then, there were Jews that survived in catacombs. It's another amazing Odessa story. Underneath Odessa, there's a whole chain, giant chain, of the catacombs, the former limestone miles, the labyrinth, underground labyrinth of about 1,500 miles. There are basements, bunkers, tunnels, storm drains, natural caves. Historically, these catacombs were used by criminals and also by those who wanted to bring illegal goods to the ports for all different illegal activities. Now, during the war, they were partisans, mainly Jewish, who went down to catacombs, and several Jewish families that went together with them. This up, down, lower photograph, it's the Jewish family photographed inside those catacombs. And the upper photograph, these are Jewish partisans coming out of catacombs after Odessa was liberated. Another story is absolutely incredible. This lady, her name is Lucia Kalika. When the Nazis occupied Odessa, she was 18, together with her sister and her mom. They lived in this house. They went to the basement of their house. She says they thought it was for a couple days. She thought if she knew they would have stayed in that basement of the house for 820 days, they would have never had courage to go there. They survived Nazi occupation in that basement. There were two sisters, their neighbors, Olga and Anna Kantarovich. They were Jews, but they had documents that they were Karaites. That's what we're going to discuss when we speak about Crimea, who Karaites were and why, being Jews, they were treated as non-Jews. I'll tell you all the details, but it's the week after the next one. Unfortunately, her book that she wrote and published is available in Russian only. I would love to find somebody who can translate it into English, because it's an incredible story of a family surviving in a dungeon in the basement of their own house. And another story, which is very Odessa. See, Odessa is a lot about humor and a lot about strange coincidences, strange stories. This is the psychiatric hospital, and this man is Shevelov Evgeny. He was the head of the psychiatric hospital. Together with his son Andrei, during the war, they were hiding Jews in their hospital as patients, teaching them how to act as if they were mentally sick. His son Andrei gave an interview explaining the story, how exactly they survived, how they were able to help. They did not have records. You can't tell exact number of those who survived in that clinic, but I think it's a very, very, very Odessa story. In the Soviet times, Odessa was a resort. Soviet people would come to Odessa to, get some nice glass of beer and go to the beach and take a boat and just enjoy this southern life, the life different from most of Soviet Union, which was all northern and cold and gloomy. This is Odessa main synagogue. As I told you, was returned to the Jewish community in 1996. Once Odessa Jew, always Odessa Jew. And Jews from Odessa say, we Jews are strange people, born in the USSR, willing to return to our homeland, end up in America, but dreaming about living in Odessa. You can never forget Odessa. It's the place that you keep in your heart and you always want to go back. Even now, when it's so different, when you have so very few Jews there, and most of it's Jewish character was lost. It's still unique and still different from any other place. There's great Jewish museum in Odessa. It's not grand, it's not like interactive or something, but it has a lot of data, a lot of photographs explaining the life in Odessa. I do hope that one day we'll be able to meet and visit this museum, maybe together, who knows. And then we could go and pay respect to the Holocaust memorial in the heart of Odessa. And it's also new. It's in Ukrainian and Hebrew, so it was only put up after the liberation, after the fall of Soviet Union. And not far from that monument, there is an alley of the righteous of the world, with trees naming those people of Odessa who helped Jews survive during the Nazi occupation. Our last stop today for a couple minutes is the stop in Dnipro, the city in the center of Ukraine on Dnipro River. And it's an industrial city. You don't really visit it as part of your tour. It's a big industrial city with the new modern residential buildings, with the port, with bridges. There were Jews living in Dnipro since late 18th century. There's nothing that very special that I can tell you about the history of Jews in Dnipro, but there is something very special about contemporary situation. See, in 2001, there were no more than 10,000 Jews in Dnipro, nothing grand, but there was very ambitious Chabad rabbi who came to Dnipro and who, together with some Jewish businessmen of Ukraine, turned Dnipro into the world center of Jewish life. What you have on your screen now, this is JCC. This is Jewish Community Center in Dnipro. It pretends to be one of the largest, if not the largest in the world, definitely the largest in Europe. Down below there, that's the synagogue. In the center, you have press center. They publish 2 Jewish newspapers. They have Jewish program on the TV. They have medical clinic, Holocaust Museum and Research Institution, different educational center for kids, the hotel, the conference rooms. It's just giant thing. And it serves the purpose of making Jews feel different, feel very, very comfortable and self-esteem. This is the man, Shmuel Kamenetsky, an Israeli-born Chabad rabbi, chief rabbi since 1990. He's very ambitious. He's seriously turning Dnipro into the world center of Judaism with the help of the leading Jewish Ukrainian businessmen, specifically Gennady Boголюбов, and of course Kolomoisky. Everybody knows him because he's very active in giving public speeches and very active in politics. Of course, they supported the current president of Ukraine, Zelensky, on the last elections. They have the synagogue, it's called Golden Rose, and everything is done grand. Everything is done, in a very impressive way. So the story of Dnipro is the story how you can turn the city without much Jewish history and without big Jewish community into something unique in a modern Jewish world. This was something that I wanted to tell and show you today. Thank you very much for your patience and attention. I'm ready to answer questions.
Hi, thank you for taking us on that adventure. I hope those of you who have family from this part of Ukraine now know a little bit more about where you come from. Maybe you come from the criminals. Maybe you come from the wealthy people. Things to think about are, if you come from, I guess, Kiev, you probably don't come from ancient Kiev. You come from when you went through the stories, the more modern Kiev. So your family probably comes from another part of the Pale of the settlement. So I learned a lot, and I hope you did as well. I love the story about the Rusla and the boat. I don't think I knew about that. So I'll have to find some articles to share with you all to read. So here are the questions that I see so far. Number one, let me just actually make sure the chat is working. The synagogues that you showed us, the beautiful synagogues that were built, I assume you said were built in a modern type of service. And yet today they're all operated by Chabad. If the people who built the synagogues came back and saw who was operating the synagogues, wouldn't they be a little upset? In other words,
oh yes,
yeah.
Oh sure. They wanted something different. They believed in secular education. They believed in, see, those people, they believed in progress. They believed in ideas of Jewish enlightenment, of German Haskalah. If you become ideal citizen, then you become useful and then you live freely. But you know this idea failed very much.
Because of the history of all the cities you showed us, Kiev has this oldest history, I think. I don't know if it's the oldest in Ukraine,
Right.
but it's,
Yes.
is there evidence of the old original Jewish community, or has that all been wiped out? And really what you don't think you can find is the Jewish community of like the 1800s.
See, there are no buildings, nothing that survived from, let's say, 11th century, considering the fact that the city was mainly built of wood, and so it was nearly leveled to the ground by Tatar Mongols. So our evidences would be documents, coins, some places in toponymic, like the names of the places, and also the writings of the rabbis, because there were several rabbis who wrote important books, and they were from Kiev. So we have this, but probably if you start like excavations to that layer, you may have found something, as it was, for example, found in Crimea, which I will tell you next week, the week after the next one.
Okay. Ukraine and the Holocaust. So you've taken us to different parts of Eastern Europe. We went to Estonia, for example, with you, and Russia, and now Ukraine. We've had programs about Lithuania, where my family's from, and some of us have learned about Belarus. Some parts of Eastern Europe have in recent history addressed Holocaust. Some have denied it. Where does Ukraine fall within really addressing the Holocaust and what happened and their role in it versus total denial and building up the people who were perpetrators, like in Lithuania? So where does Ukraine fall on that spectrum?
Ukraine is in a difficult position. I would say that with the Holocaust, it's more or less Ukraine came to conclusion, more or less, that there was Holocaust and that the monuments have to be erected and the education has to be done and the museums have to be open. So Holocaust is more or less part of the public discussion. Unlike, for instance, the pogroms of the Civil War, and unlike that story, the pogroms of Cossacks during the Civil War, that story is nearly unknown in the Ukrainian society. Nobody really speaks about it, and it's nearly impossible to raise any public discussion about that. Because Cossacks are national heroes, because they are observed as national heroes. And for Ukraine, it's also very much, the Holocaust is very much comes very much together with the subject of Soviet regime, because Ukraine has its own trauma. It's called Golodomor. It's a period of late 1920s and late 1920s, when Soviet government organized like a blockade, like a siege in Ukraine, and so millions of Ukrainians died of hunger. And that's the major trauma of Ukraine. And so they better speak about that rather than about Holocaust. It's not but still, especially, I would say, especially last 10 years, Holocaust became part of the public discussion.
There was a question which relates to everything you're telling us now. I don't know if you can answer it, which is, you showed us the slides and you said this is before the contemporary war in Ukraine, but do we know what's going on like in Dnipro? Do we know if that Jewish synagogue and the big building, have they been damaged? Are they okay? No. Is the Jewish community still there, or have they left?
Jewish community is still there. Okay. Yeah. Nipra has not been damaged because it's not south enough and not east enough. Right now, Kherson and Mariupol is in hands of Russia. Russian army seems to come back to Kharkiv and might want to take over Kharkiv soon. Russian army is targeting Odessa, and Odessa is in great danger, because, as I told you, it seems that the plan of Russian government is to cut Odessa from the access to Black Sea completely. So for this purpose, they need to take over all those towns along the northern shore of Black Sea, including Odessa. So Odessa is in a terrible danger. Nikolaev, which is also traditionally Jewish town pretty close to Odessa, is under heavy attack last 2-3 weeks. Dnipro is safe. Kyiv by now is safe if Russian army doesn't decide to go back there. But Odessa is critical. I mean, we'll see. It's hard to tell what it's going to be, but looking at the logic of the situation, Odessa will be attacked very soon.
Okay, well, we'll be ready to understand the significance and what's going on because of this program. Jeff Kaufman wanted to see if you wanted to mention, or maybe we could do a follow-up about Yuvchenko's poem Babi Yar, which was apparently a huge deal in the Soviet Union in its time. I don't know if we have time to actually discuss it. It's really kind of overtime, but maybe I can find an article about that and we can share it, unless there's something you wanted to say about that before I ask my last question.
It was after the war. It was in the 60s. It was poet Voznesensky who visits in Kiev, wrote a poem Babi Yar, and at the beginning he mentioned Jews there. He's Russian. He's not Jewish, but he mentioned Jews. The poem was strictly prohibited to be published. He had to mark out anything connected to Jewish thing from that poem. So that's why it became so well known, especially in the West, because it's a very clear symbol of what Soviet government did to Jews. When Soviet Jews, especially Ukrainian Jews, especially Jews of Kyiv, they were cut from their memory. Like, you have a memory in your family, but you can only talk about it to your wife, maybe to your brother or sister, and that's it. You can't go to the place. You can't come. You can't mark it. I don't know, put the flower there. Or, okay, you don't know Kaddish, but maybe you want to say your own prayer. Maybe you just want to come, sit, and tell, I still remember the names of my relatives. Kyiv Jews were completely cut from that. There were lots of attempts. There are photographs. If we ever have a talk about the memory of Holocaust in Soviet Union, there are photographs, for example, of Jews trying to come to Babi Yar, trying to organize something there. No, from Soviet government, the answer was no. There was always an army and the police waiting for Jews. And in the small places, in the small villages, it was easier because the government was further away. But Kiev, the Soviet government never wanted people to remember that it was a Jewish city at some point, that there were so many Jews living there. There is a story there. Last time you asked about what language Jews speak in those places. In Kiev, many Jews actually spoke Ukrainian. And there is a story of a Jewish lady. She was a girl at the times of the war. And during that march to death, she lost her mother in a crowd. And she started calling her mother in Ukrainian, because that was their spoken language at home. And the German soldier picked her and dragged her out of the crowd, saying, "Oh, you're not Žyd, you're not Jewish. What are you doing here? Go home." And so she survived. So that's what it is.
As I mentioned, what I learned from our trip to Eastern Europe was that the Nazis murdered our people, and then the Soviets destroyed our memory. Mm-hmm. And both are bad, but the memory part is, they're both very painful. And many people just don't know that part about what the Soviets did. That's but I don't want you all getting on a plane to fight in Ukraine right now. So that's too dangerous, Rob Fesher. You stay here. I need you here. And Jeff Kaufman, he's tough. Maybe he can go. Last questions in Israel. So many Russians, and I assume Ukrainians, made Aliyah in contemporary times to Israel. Is there a neighborhood that is like Ukrainian? And what's the relationship between Ukrainian and Russian Jews? I mean, you're a Russian Jew. Do you interact with Ukrainian Jews? Is there neighborhoods that we should know of when we come to Israel, that this would be a Ukrainian Jewish neighborhood, this would be a Russian neighborhood, this is where you go to get the Ukrainian food, or is it the community kind of dispersed throughout Israel?
No, it's everywhere. There are Ukrainian Jews in every Israeli city, and there are Russian Jews in every Israeli city. Now, because of the last events, there are lots of specific Ukrainian events. Like, for example, 2 weeks ago, there was a Ukrainian fair in Tel Aviv. But see, Russian Jews and Ukrainian Jews can be very different. Like, each person is different person. My best friend, she is a Jew from Kharkiv. She made Aliyah when she was a child 30 years ago. The father of my daughter's best friend, his family is also from Kharkiv. So we don't have troubles in our communication. But in a Russian-speaking community in Israel, you may find Ukrainian Jews who would not speak to Russian Jews. You can find Russian Jews who do not agree with what's going on in Russia. So it's very much mixed. But most of normal Russian Jews, they do not support the war that Russia is running against Ukraine, and we do whatever we can to support Ukrainian Jews there and here as well. It's pretty clear for us.
Well, thank you. Those of you coming to Israel with us know that we've invited Evgenia to dinner with us, probably in Tel Aviv. So you'll meet Evgenia in person as part of our adventure, as well as Paul Lips will be at one of the dinners. And we have so many friends in Israel now. Hopefully we can meet many of them on the adventure in the fall. Evgenia, thank you. We look forward to next week. Where do we go next week?
Next week we go west of Ukraine, Galicia. We do Lviv and Brody.
So go home, open up your family history books, find out where you're all from. We'll make the poll a little easier to fill out. See if any of you are from that part of the Jewish world. Thank you, Evgenia, and thank you for everybody for joining us and supporting CSP. Have a good day. Be safe. Lots to unpack. Many pieces of the puzzle. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Hey, Phyllis Gilmore. Good to see you. Bye, everybody.